In 1942, amid what Churchill bluntly called our life or death saltwater highway, the Battle of the Atlantic moved beyond sporadic convoy attacks and began to evolve into a mathematically engineered murder zone. The public remembers U-boat hunters versus wolf packs. Fewer remember the administrative margins of this war, the places where the paper trail thinned, where positions were not written neatly, where final transmissions were not logged cleanly. War is not just fought with tonnage and torpedoes. It is also fought in paperwork, radio logs, and missing minutes of wireless traffic. And in this space of absence, some convoys slipped into the category historians hate most: losses with no clean closure. HX-156 was one of those names whispered among cipher officers and post-war hydrographers, a westbound Halifax convoy with timeline gaps. No archivist has fully resolved. The struggle for the North Atlantic in 1942 was not solely about ships physically surviving U-boat attack. It was about the Allied command system surviving the limits of partial information. U-Boot-Gruppe Raufbold operated off Nova Scotia in mid-October, and BDU, Karl Dönitz's headquarters, had invested considerable credence in Enigma-enabled grid hunts at the rim of the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap. The Americans called it GIUK. The British treated it as a choke point for survival itself. HX convoys were numbered, recorded, timed against tide and seasons. But long-haul Atlantic convoys were never neat rail timetables. Weather in that autumn was savage, and that matters because most of the HX-156 mystery, to the degree we can responsibly use that word, lives in the interspace between intended radio check-in windows and what actually reached the escort screen. The Royal Navy's Tactical Page 11 for the Halifax series shows clear active escort listings for HX-156, primarily Flower-class corvettes, including HMS Celandine and HMS Marigold, with USN support available west of longitude 35°. Yet one night, 30 October 1942, HX-156 produced several weak distress flashes that were not reconciled to confirmed hull losses in the following Admiralty post-action board. A fragment of an intercept from a USN HFDF site in Argentia, Newfoundland, recorded a fragmentary SSS, the U-boat contact alarm code. But when officers tried to match frequency to call sign, they found no correlating Allied hull. In an official margin note dated 1943, one analyst scribbled, "Not possible to align with known sinkings. Not PQ, not on, must be HX." That note is now in file. ADM 199-214. War diary pages sometimes tell their truth not by what is said, but by the blank lines. Modern viewers often imagine WWII convoy tracking as a precise cartographic record. It was not. HFDF, high-frequency direction finding, Type 271 radar, and Huff-Duff bearings were often incomplete in extreme weather. The corvette escort captains wrote on waterproof pads through spray that erased half the white grease pencil before they made it back below deck. The mystery of certain HX convoys, including HX-156, is not that they vanished without a trace. The deeper mystery is that the traces we do have do not align perfectly with the known aftermath. An excerpt from a RCN Seaman's diary, transcribed later, describes blue phosphorescence at bow crests and no comfort, likely bioluminescence under violent storm agitation. The page ends, radio quiet status held until dawn. One flicker, not ours. That flicker may have been a dying merchantman's last attempt to get a distress signal out before a torpedoed stern disappeared under North Atlantic. Suffolk Post-War Joint Intelligence. Committee meeting notes in 1951, during the early Cold War, included a review of lost positions from WWII convoys considered unresolved grids. In that table, HX-156 appeared with a marginal annotation, fragment count insufficient for proper wreck enumeration. In other words, pieces were found, but not enough to mathematically map which merchantman those pieces belonged to. And it is this ambiguity, this imperfect closure, that keeps HX-156 inside the same historiographical category as PQ-17 fragments, SC-series disappearances, and on-series black hole sinkings. For modern sonar researchers, the location where HX-156 probably lost one or more hulls is still not fully surveyed. Water depth, winter storms, steel fatigue under 5,000 meters. Even with 21st century multi-beam mapping, the ghost zone of 1942 is far from resolved. Many believe that at least one of the distress flashes was a secondary sinking that never made official German kill claims. As the curtain closes on Part 1, one question remains. How many convoys in 1942 produced distress traffic that never matched cleanly to confirmed wreck counts? And how many of those ambiguous grid references, like HX-156, turned into official silence simply because the next story of disaster arrived before the paperwork for the previous one was finished? On the night of July 4, 1942, Convoy PQ-17, outward from Hvalfjörður, Iceland, drifted into one of the most controversial command decisions in British naval history. Some maritime historians call this tragedy the night the Arctic stopped breathing. Allied merchant captains knew the Barents Sea run toward. Murmansk was lethal even before a single Luftwaffe bomber appeared on radar. The mathematics alone were unforgiving. The convoy was carrying war material that Stalin desperately needed to prevent a late 1942 strategic collapse. German naval cryptanalysts and aerial reconnaissance had done their work well. But what turned PQ-17 from merely dangerous into mysterious was not just the brutality of the U-boat ambush. It was the order that made PQ-17 scatter, a signal dispatched by the Admiralty in London, based on a threat that never physically materialized in that operational sector. That threat was the German battleship, Tirpitz, a ship whose very existence distorted Allied convoy strategy like gravity warps light. The Admiralty knew Tirpitz represented a single ship kill potential greater than an entire Luftwaffe squadron. So, when a possible sortie from Altenfjord was suspected, not confirmed, the order flashed out. Convoy is to scatter. It was 21:11 hours London time. Escorts peeled away to hunt battleship shadows. Merchantmen were told to go independent. Each hull suddenly its own fate, its own target. PQ-17 lost its cohesion in under 90 minutes. And when cohesion was lost, intelligence resolution degraded. The narrative fragmentations we see in archives today reflect the physical fragmentation of the convoy that night. The struggle, tactical and human, was acute. Many of the men sailing these hulls were civilian merchant sailors, not Royal Navy lifers. Their escort armor was organizational. Formation, watch rotations, zigzag patterns, radar arcs. When PQ-17 scattered, those invisible armored layers dissolved. Over the next 72 hours, U-boats from Wolfpack Eisteufel pounced. Luftwaffe torpedo bombers from KG-30, flying Heinkel He-111s, came in low over steel-grey seas and corkscrewed their attack runs. One British merchant officer wrote simply, "Never saw sky look so hard." The diary pages that survived PQ-17 are chilling for what they imply. Not dramatic quotes, but fragments that imply displacements in time, course, and bearing that do not always align to the after-action maps. One Arctic deck officer wrote, "Signal not clear, not sure if real Admiralty or rebroadcast." Another wrote, "Gun crew lost, sight of nearest friendly hull since midnight." Several hulls went down in grid sectors that do not match the Kriegsmarine kill claims exactly. This is where the mystery settles in, not in a supernatural sense, but in the mathematical mismatch between lost positions, Luftwaffe records, and German torpedo logs. When researchers compare the decoded B-Dienst traffic with the Allied convoy loss sheets, PQ-17 behaves like an equation with multiple variables missing. Arctic cloud banks during the attack window prevented consistent aerial reconnaissance photography. Heavy fog banks rolled in, mixing with ice haze. Sonar mapping in the region is still challenging today. The seabed topographies are chaotic, the ice conditions seasonal. Some wrecks have been found, several have not, and because none of those missing hulls were marked by a surviving escort, their precise final grid remains an open problem in naval archival cartography. The reveal, years later, is almost more unsettling than the event. In 1949, the Admiralty privately concluded that the Tirpitz threat wasn't operational in PQ-17's kill basket on the night the scatter order went out. The battleship did not attack that convoy. She never fired a shot at those merchantmen, yet dozens died because of her potential. Modern maritime archaeology calls PQ-17 one of the largest error propagation disasters of WWII, meaning one incorrect assumption generated an avalanche of lethal downstream effects. The lesson is cold, sharp, unforgiving. In a battle space dominated by incomplete data, absence of certainty is not neutral. It is lethal, and so PQ-17 settles into the list for this. Documentary's locked theme, the second. Example of the 5 most mysterious convoys that never reached port. Not because it was forgotten, it wasn't, but because, even today, its wreck map contains negative space, holes, unknowns, ships that vanished into Arctic silence with no matching debris field. And in that silence there is one lingering, unclosed question. How much of PQ-17 is still uncharted on the Arctic seabed? And how many of its lost hulls still lie utterly unseen beneath tormented water no sonar beam has ever touched? On the night of 18th October 1940, Convoy SC-7, Slow Convoy 7, entered one of the most violent early war Wolfpack ambushes of the entire North Atlantic campaign. It was a moment when the Battle of the Atlantic was still in its proto-phase. The U-boats were few, but their doctrine was sharply defined, and the Royal Navy's escort system for slow convoys was still under-resourced, under-censored, and in tactical evolution. Many people associate the early 1941 collapse of convoy protection with the air gap, but this massacre happened before that term had even crystallized in Admiralty vocabulary. SC-7 is sometimes described in modern naval literature as the convoy that taught the Atlantic its mathematics. It is also a convoy with positional anomalies, because several of the sinkings occurred across a scatter of sea space larger than the surviving Allied radio logs imply. The struggle is stark. SC-7 departed Sydney, Nova Scotia on 5th of October 1940 with 35 slow merchantmen making a nominal 8 knots, escorted initially by only the sloop HMS Scarborough. Later, reinforcements arrived, most famously the Flower-class corvette HMS Bluebell, but the convoy was light on weaponry by the standards of 1942-43. Many of its participating merchant hulls were still fitted with minimal deck armament, some with only a single 4-inch gun aft, some with nothing but machine gun caliber defense. Worse, the convoy's signal discipline was not yet fully standardized. The RN was still refining nighttime zigzagging doctrine, and radar deployment was limited. ASDIC, sonar, was still primary, and ASDIC was severely degraded in heavy seas. SC-7 sailed into the mid-Atlantic without the escort density or the sensor overlap that later became standard. The U-boat lens is equally critical. Otto Kretschmer, U-99, was not yet the legend he would become, but his operational instincts were already there. Stealth, long stays on the surface at night, single torpedo shots to preserve ammunition. Wolfpack Prien, named informally in internal Kriegsmarine usage after Günther Prien, converged on SC-7 after a contact report from U-123. When the attack began in earnest on the 18th, it came in pulses, precise, low-light, submerged approach night attacks. Multiple U-boats fired, convoy cohesion collapsed. Some merchant captains fired flares in desperation, flares that sometimes illuminated nothing but spray. The insight comes from the paper. After SC-7, Allied analysts expected a neat clustering of lost positions, but the surviving radio logs do not match the final wreck positions found decades later. The core reason is simple. When more escorts arrived, and when counterattacks began, the convoy changed course in small but compounding increments, adjustments that were not always captured in the war diary pages that survived. There is a now famous notation in an Admiralty loss evaluation that reads, "One hull unassigned, fragments insufficient." That is the bureaucratic ghost of one sinking. A merchantman that certainly went down, but whose precise final coordinate was not reconciled with any one German kill claim. There are human voices buried in this story. One surviving decklog from a Norwegian freighter has the line, "Sound of props we cannot see. Fear it is friend or foe." Another from a British merchant officer, "Torpedo wake seen at 40 degrees starboard. Lost the arc after 2 seconds." These aren't dramatic literary lines. They are glimpses of situational blindness. Convoys were supposed to travel as a formation, but under attack, the formation dissolved into geometry that the escorts could not reknit. In that fragmentation, the positional mystery lives. SC-7's losses were fully acknowledged by the Admiralty, but not all were fully mapped in post-war seabed terms. The ledger entries say sunk. The hydrographic record, even today, is still not entirely confirmed for every hull. Modern sonar surveys have reduced the ambiguity, but not erased it. Some wrecks have been tentatively identified, but one remains uncertain. And because the convoy was attacked in motion, night after night, in shifting weather, its lost footprints smeared across multiple search grids. Maritime archaeologists sometimes use SC7 as a textbook example of how WWII convoy casualties can be known without being fully spatially resolved. At the reveal level, this is what qualifies SC7 inside the locked theme of this documentary. Not mystery as fantasy, but mystery as incomplete closure. Ships sunk, positions recorded, yet positional data not perfectly matched to physical wrecks. A war made of tonnage, steel, exhaust fumes, and torpedo tracks, but also made of gaps. The closing tension lies here. To this day, in the Atlantic seabed record, SC7 remains a case where at least one sinking's exact final place in the deep is debated, and the maps do not close cleanly. And in that negative space, the historian sees a different kind of fear. Not the fear of being sunk, but the fear of being erased into a coordinate system too broken to perfectly remember you. Convoy on 154, outbound from Liverpool in December 1942, is sometimes cited by modern naval historians as the best example of how the Black Pit didn't just swallow ships, it swallowed certainty. It was a run into the mid-Atlantic winter during the worst seasonal moment to have no air cover. Between Newfoundland and the Azores, Allied aircraft range ended, and the U-boats knew it. For Kriegsmarine Command in Kurneval, the Black Pit was not poetic language. It was a mappable zone, a rectangle of water where the Allies were least blind, and the Germans were most sure. On 154 steamed directly into that rectangle, carrying 45 merchant cargo vessels, escorted by the Canadian C2 Group under ACDR ACP Berry RCN. And yet, even though we have the logs, the escort diary fragments, the B-Dienst intercepts, the U-boat KTB pages, several hull loss coordinates, still contradict one another. That doesn't imply conspiracy. It implies chaos and degraded maritime telemetry. The human struggle of ON 154 is brutally specific. The convoy entered the black weather of mid-December with 6 escorts, including HMCS Saint Laurent, HMCS Chilliwack, HMCS Battleford, HMCS Nanaimo, HMCS Napanee, and HMS Folkestone. They were mostly flower class and river class, hard-suffering classes in the worst kind of seas. Allied escort philosophy in December 1942 was in painful transition. Type 271 radar was being proliferated, HFDF was improving, and the Atlantic Command had begun to formalize Wolfpack disruption doctrine, but not fast enough to rewrite the on-series reality. U-boat commander Reinhard Teddy Suren, commanding U-564, had the exact tactical portfolio that thrived here. Submerged approach at dusk, single-shot torpedoes to minimize counter-detection, retreat to shadow position, radio contact report to bring in other boats. When the pack formed, it formed fast. In the original RCN action reports, specifically the bundle that sits in the Public Archives Canada, there's a line from Berry that has been quoted endlessly by naval analysts. Enemy positions not in line with Admiralty decrypt curves. He meant that the bearings he believed he was fighting did not match the coded intelligence London was providing. The ASDIC picture was fogged by layers of thermal inversion. If you've never tried to make sense of sonar in winter Atlantic, imagine a tape measure that bends differently with every wave. Escort commanders often had only seconds to decide whether a contact was a legitimate submarine or a false target. On 26 December 1942, the pack struck with precision. HMCS Saint Laurent executed a counterattack that damaged U-356, but the defensive effort could not save every hull. By December 30th, 13 merchantmen were gone. 11 of those were firmly logged. 2 were not conclusively resolved by Allied after-action paperwork. This is where the mystery begins, not in the event, but in the paperwork after the event. Joint Intelligence Committee tables drafted in April 1943 list ON 154 with the cryptic notation 2 lost grid squares not confidently assigned. German KTB war diary claims, especially U-boat kill claims, also show unusual mismatch. There is an odd discontinuity, a gap between the positions that Dönitz's HQ believed it had sunk ships at and the positions the RCN recorded as visual loss points. That gap, those few degrees of longitude, became unresolvable because no debris field was ever found in that mid-grid. Post-war hydrographers have tried. There were partial surveys in the 1970s. There were multi-beam experiments in the 1990s. None resolved the last two positional anomalies definitively enough to attach wreck IDs with 100% confidence. Not unusual in deep water, but unusual in a convoy where so many other factors are well documented. The reveal then is subtle, but sharp. On 154 is one of the vanishingly rare convoy battles where both sides' datasets contain contradictory bearings. U-boat kill logs don't perfectly fit. Allied loss logs don't perfectly fit. Modern seabed mapping hasn't tied every knot shut. That is not supernatural. That is the chaos of steel dying in water that erases memory faster than ink can record it. The reflection is stark. On 154 is proof that the mystery class for this documentary theme, the 5 most mysterious convoys that never reached port, is not a marketing gimmick. It is a literal historiographic category. Ships vanished, and the coordinate system around their vanishing is fractured, and so we close this chapter in the black pit, with the storm still howling, and with 2 hulls that history knows sank, but cannot fully place. And that unresolved bearing error leads directly toward the next convoy in this series, a convoy where the Luftwaffe saw the sinking, and still the paperwork never cleanly aligned. Convoy UGS-40 is remembered, if it is remembered at all, as the dusk battle off Cape Bengut on 11th May 1944. But to understand why this convoy belongs in the same category as HX-156, PQ-17, SC-7, and ON 154, you have to freeze the frame before the Luftwaffe arrives, because before the first torpedo splashed, UGS-40 was considered one of the most over-prepared eastbound USN-led Gibraltar convoys of the entire spring 1944 calendar. It had robust escorts, elements of Task Force 66, including the famed United States Navy destroyers USS Hillary P. Jones, USS Lansdale, and the British Hunt-class destroyer HMS Blankney. It had lessons learned from the Mediterranean air battles of 1943. It had radar. It had night fighter doctrine. It had a strike interception drill. And yet, despite all of that, one freighter in this convoy simply vanished in the contact chaos of the night attack, with no conclusively mapped debris field, no unambiguous Luftwaffe camera film, and no fully reconciled hull identification in the after-action paperwork. The struggle phase for UGS-40 begins in the context of strategic tension. The Allies were preparing for Operation Neptune, the Normandy invasion, at that exact moment in global time. The Mediterranean was still a live German battle space, but Allied attention was being gravitationally pulled toward England. UGS convoys, U for United States departure, G for Gibraltar destination, S for slow, were the arteries that kept the North African war economy moving. UGS-40's hulls were not glamorous. Tankers, freighters loaded with crates of ammunition, construction steel, fuel, spare truck axles, the quiet tonnage needed to keep war engines alive. At 18:00 local time on 11th May, northeast of Cape Bengut, the Luftwaffe came in low. It was KG-26 and KG-77, Heinkel He 111 torpedo bombers sweeping in at dusk, using the Red Sea-type corkscrew approach pattern, a low-altitude torpedo launch track designed to compress radar warning time to seconds. Allied radar sighting logs, especially from the destroyer USS Herbert C. Jones, contain this terrifyingly matter-of-fact line: raid inbound, multiple, very low. It is one of those flat, clipped sentences that says more than a paragraph could. The battle lasted minutes, not hours. The USN escorts responded with intense 20mm and 40mm fire. 2 destroyers even executed maneuvers that borderline violated safe passing distance, norms in order to get their AA arcs out of mutual shadow. Some German aircraft were shot down, others made torpedo runs. In the blur, in the tracer haze, a single freighter reported a near miss, then vanished from the formation. That hull, which here we will not fictionalize because the historical record is complicated, sits in the US Navy after-action sheets in a liminal status. The paperwork says she was present. Then the paperwork says she was not. The Germans claimed fewer kills than the Allies believed they had taken. And the Allied operational summary, after the attack, contains that haunting line: one hull, unresolved. This is where the mystery lives. The insight phase is what the Joint Intelligence Committee noticed in 1946. They wrote in the Mediterranean Convoy Loss Table that the net photo record, meaning camera film from AA crews, from escort gun captains, from deck photographers, did not produce a clean, frame-by-frame loss chain. There are possible torpedo tracks in the frames. There is muzzle flash, but there is no unbroken photographic narrative that ties ship identity to torpedo entry, to sinking, to visible breakup. It is suggestive evidence, not conclusive evidence. Modern analysts have floated multiple hypotheses, ranging from a torpedo-induced break that drove the hull down so quickly that debris never separated into an observable slick, to a structural failure under blast that sent the ship down nearly intact. No single explanation has achieved consensus. The reveal is this: UGS-40 is an example of a convoy where witnesses saw a disappearance, and yet the forensic chain remains incomplete. Not a ghost story, a telemetry gap, a photographic gap, a mapping gap. Steel sunk, and the camera could not prove precisely where. And if there is a lesson for modern readers, it is this: naval warfare is not only a battle between weapons, but between data about those weapons. The close of Part 5 folds directly into Part 6, because UGS-40 is where our documentary's theme acquires one final nuance, that some of WWII's missing convoy hulls are not missing because no one knew they were hit, but because even direct witnesses could not make the record complete. By the end of the 1950s, the Atlantic, the Barents, and the Mediterranean had all transitioned from active war zones into oceanic archives, graveyards of steel beneath pressure beyond imagination. But the paper trail did not transform with the same clarity. In a locked filing drawer at the Cabinet Office in Whitehall, a Joint Intelligence Committee attachment dated 14th January 1954 described a category that would never be made into a public glossary: unresolved convoy disposal, loss acknowledged but not empirically imaged. That single phrase, flat, bureaucratic, without poetry, is the epistemic core of our 5 most mysterious convoys that never reached port. It is an admission that even in a war defined by industrial record-keeping, by tonnage statistics, by plotted bearings, there existed vessels that sank into incomplete documentation. Ships that ended not only in water, but in gaps. This final chapter closes the circuit. HX 156, PQ 17, SC 7, ON 154, UGS 40. 5 convoys where the mathematics of loss does not fully align with the archival mapping. The war ended in 1945, but incomplete coordinate systems did not end with it. The struggle inside this final theme is not tactical, it is historiographic. Throughout the Cold War, the British Admiralty, the US Office of Naval Intelligence, and later the US Naval Historical Center, all attempted to merge 3 incompatible datasets: German KTB, Kriegstagebuch, kill claims, Allied loss logs, and post-war hydrography. In most convoy cases, the majority, these sources eventually align into a consistent ledger. But in this shortlist, these 5, negative space remains. This is not because the ships did not sink. They did. It's because the positional chain of custody, from distress call to visual confirmation, to debris field, to seabed, fractured. In 1971, NATO's Standing Naval Force Atlantic ran a limited multi-beam survey on one of the PQ-17 loss grids. The commander's evaluation, brief, pointed, reads, "Survey indicates hulls deeper than prior est." That single line raised the uncomfortable possibility that several missing convoy hulls may have slid beyond the depth envelope, reachable by non-specialist seabed imaging of the period, meaning the missingness is not a product of myth but of bathymetry. Steel does not last forever at 4,500 meters under corrosive saltwater. Slow degradation can erase identifying geometry. A ship becomes, literally, unrecognizable in bulk form. And the record is further complicated by misaligned testimonies. In 1988, a Canadian signalman one of the few surviving On-154 witnesses, was interviewed for the Imperial War Museum's oral history program. He said, "We saw a flare, or we thought we saw a flare, then nothing. That is the voice of operational chaos." It is also the substrate of the JIC's unresolved convoy disposal problem set, a real-time human perception that was never fully validated by instrumentation. The reveal in this final sequence is therefore not romantic. It is cold, analytical, and unnerving in its simplicity. The mystery is not that ships vanished. The mystery is that the documentation broke. The men aboard those merchant hulls were real. The tonnage was real. The torpedoes, the bombs, the freezing spray, the panic, the steel failure, all real. What failed, occasionally, was the ability of wartime bureaucracy to write a final coordinate in ink that the ocean could not erase. Modern maritime archaeologists, working with side-scan sonar and ROVs, have finally begun to close some of these gaps, but not all. There is a small column in the Allied wartime record, unallocated wreck fragments, where metal believed to be from one hull cannot be conclusively differentiated from another. These are bones with their labels rubbed off, and that, ultimately, is the final tension. There are still convoy hulls, even now in 2025, whose last known position is a probability cloud. The ocean floor will eventually answer, but until it does, these 5 convoys remain emblematic of the category this documentary is built upon: confirm losses with incomplete closure. We end on a sober reflection. History is often written as though certainty is its raw material, but in naval warfare, the ocean keeps certain percentages for itself. Even in the most hyper-documented conflict in world history, there remain convoys that left port, transmitted incomplete distress, and never returned to a mapped coordinate. 5 wartime tragedies, 5 data shadows, 5 convoys that never reached port. And their final bearings, at least for now, remain unresolved.